Transportation Studies. We are very fortunate to have with us today Professor Arnold Barnett from MIT, where he is George Eastman Professor of Management Science and Professor of Statistics. His research involves applied statistical analysis focused on problems of health and safety, particularly aviation safety, where he is described as the world's leading expert by NBC News. He has received the President's citation from the Flight Safety Foundation for truly outstanding contributions on behalf of safety. He has worked for 16 airlines as a flight attendant and 6 airports, the U.S. FAA and the U.S. TSA, and he is also an outstanding teacher who has been honored 15 times for outstanding teaching at MIT. Professor Barnett.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Hansen. Professor Hansen and I have worked together on some projects involving aviation safety and security, and it's a great honor to be here, and it's also nice to see so many people here on a Friday afternoon. I remember once when the airlines were having financial trouble, we had Bob Crandall, the president of American at the time, the CEO, and when he saw the plenty group of people in the room, he said, "If only our airplanes looked like this." But anyway, it's a delight to be here. And let me discuss the talk. Yesterday in Professor Hansen's class, I talked about aviation safety in first world countries and in the United States, and up through 2019, the safety record was absolutely marvelous, the recent safety record, almost as if accidents were on the verge of extinction. The hope was that security was in hand, and what could go wrong? Well, we know what went wrong, COVID. And I was interested in aviation safety in connection with COVID once people started flying again, because it's very unusual for U.S. airlines actually to disagree in public on matters of safety. The idea is that we all believe in safety, we all cooperate, which is, by the way, true. But some airlines started keeping middle seats empty on domestic flights in the interest of social distancing. And United Airlines took great issue with this, and it said social distancing through keeping the middle seat empty is quote-unquote a PR strategy and not a safety strategy. They said because if you really have to be 6 feet apart, the person 2 seats away from you is within 6 feet, the person behind you, the person ahead of you. So, of course, it's also true that if the seats next to you are not filled, then there are fewer people within a short distance of you. But they took that attitude. Well, they got a response from the CEO of Delta Airlines, Mr. Baskin, and he acidly said, at Delta, we put safety before profits, and that's why we're keeping the middle seat empty. So I remember thinking, well, can we try to model the risk of whether the plane is full, 2/3 full, or whatnot? And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. It is an exercise in modeling. There is the saying, all models are wrong, some are useful. Well, this is a model. You can make your own judgments about its utility. But let's get started. And it is work I did with Keith Fleming. He was a student. At MIT, we have a program, Masters for Business Analytics. And he worked with me on this, and he had skills in the simulation that I would not have, and he certainly contributed in that way. But let's get started. And I'll tell you what we're going to focus on today is the primary question. We're going to focus on the period June 2020 to February 21, and the question I'll ask is, what is the probability that an uninfected coach passenger would contract COVID-19 on a 2-hour U.S. domestic flight on a Boeing 737 or an Airbus 320? The reason I picked 2 hours is that's about the average duration of a flight in the U.S. The transcons are obviously longer, but when you think about it, there are a lot more short flights than long ones. Up and down the coast in California, it's only a 1-hour flight, for example. So 2 hours is about the average. The 737 and the A320 are pretty much the workhorses of, domestic aviation. And I'm not saying the A320 is opposed to the A319, but just basically planes of this sort. That was the question. And let me tell you more about what some of the airlines said. United was sort of ideological on it. United announced that the risk, even on a full United flight, of coming down with COVID-19 was, quote unquote, nearly non-existent. But they were not to be outdone by Southwest Airlines, which explained that the risk was virtually non-existent. So the question we'll consider is whether non-existent is the best way of characterizing the risk. Okay? Now, I can only tell you that to present the whole model in all its details would take much more time than we have this afternoon. And so I'm only going to give sort of an overview of the modeling that we did. But that means that if you look at it and say, wait, I don't think they considered that properly, I can always say, oh, if you only knew all that we did, you'd realize we took care of that. But anyway, I will have a paper I can share with you if you would like to see it. Now, we don't have many equations, but here's a basic equation. And if P is the probability, you're a randomly chosen passenger boarding a U.S. domestic flight. And don't forget, we're focusing on that 8-month period. Why? Well, first of all, that was after the end of the lockdown and before the emergence of vaccines. In other words, I wanted it to be a period that was somewhat homogeneous. You could also talk about the situation now, and if you want to raise it in the questions later on, we could certainly talk about it. The basic idea is this. If you're a random passenger, what is the probability that when you get on your plane, there will have N passengers in total, X of whom carry COVID-19, contagious COVID-19? Okay? And I was focusing again on plane. The hypothetical plane has 29 rows of seats, A, B, C, aisle, D, E, F. So we're talking about planes that have basically 174 coach seats on them. Okay, just as sort of the model, sort of the modal plane. And now, obviously, why does the risk depend on both N and X? The number N is the number of people on board. Well, that it depends on X is kind of obvious, right? I mean, if X is 0, if there's no one who gets on board with contagious COVID-19, you're not going to catch it on the plane itself. Why might it depend on the total number of passengers? Well, if the plane is full and you're a random passenger, your chance of being seated near the contagious passenger, if let's say X equals 1, is greater than if there are only a few people on the plane, right? In other words, your risk does depend partly on your proximity to the infected traveler. Well, if there are only 6 people on the plane, the chances are you're, 10 rows away from that person? Whereas if the plane is full, there's a greater chance you're sitting next to the person or within a row or two. So that's why N matters, the number of passengers on the plane as well as the number who are infected. But then the question is, well, given that you're on a plane with N passengers, X infected, what is the conditional probability that you as a random passenger will wind up getting infected? And by random passenger, I mean, let's suppose you have a plane with 1 infected person, 79 others who are not infected, okay? If you're one of the 79 uninfected, I'm saying you're equally likely to take any one of the 79 seats, okay? In other words, you're not necessarily biased toward being close to the person or far away. It's sort of for the random passenger. So in other words, what really has to happen to get infected is you have to be on a plane with infected people, and you have to be in close enough proximity that the issue can come up. So let's continue. And here, we just talk a little bit about the modeling. We're saying in estimating the probability distribution for the flight that you are on, okay? Here's the simplifying assumption. Let's suppose every boarding passenger has a probability P star of carrying contagious COVID-19, okay? If that's the case and there are N people on board, then the number who carry contagious COVID-19 would remember the binomial probability distribution. It doesn't really matter that much in terms of the final result, but I'm just saying that was the simple model we were using. And the question is, how do you estimate P? Okay, so the first thing is, what is the probability that the person is in fact infected? By the way, one of the things you have to take into account is that crowded flights have more people on board. I said, duh, you came from MIT to tell us that? What I mean is, if you have two flights, one has 80 on board, one has 20 on board, the one with 80 has 4 times as many people, right? So you have to take into account, when I say what's the probability of being in a flight with this number of passengers on board, we have to take into account the natural bias toward more crowded flights. And we did, okay? It's analytically not difficult. But anyway, here's what I'm going to talk to you about in terms of what is the chance that the person who boards the plane, a randomly chosen person, carries COVID-19. The strategy we follow in general terms is the following. First of all, we estimate how many Americans, this is again American domestic flights, and I just take national data, we're not focusing on individual regions or anything. What fraction of Americans contracted COVID-19 the previous week? Why previous week? Because there's, roughly speaking, if you look at the literature, something like a 7-day period in which you might infect others. So really anyone who got infected in the last week potentially could infect you. Whereas if it's more than a week, they're no longer contagious, etc. So that's the week. Now I point out that the number of people, the fraction of Americans who actually caught it last week is not the same as the confirmed cases. And in fact, just today I heard, as I was driving over here on University Avenue, that at the moment the estimate is that for every confirmed case, there are actually 14 in the United States. So that now the number you see, the official number is about 30,000. The estimate is there's something like 500,000. So we had to try to estimate the true number who got it and not just the observed number. And that's part of the modeling, which we will not discuss. But another aspect, though, that I thought was interesting is I thought, now Barnett, try to be realistic. The people who fly tend in general to be more affluent than the people who don't, okay? And there is a correlation, and there has been a correlation between the prevalence of COVID-19 and the affluence of the community, okay? The numbers are, not always exact, but nonetheless, I thought that basically those who would fly are less likely to carry COVID-19 than randomly chosen Americans. They tend to come from communities, like Menlo Park, for example, where the rate is lower than in some other communities. All right, so that was something we had to try to deal with. And another thing we had to try to deal with was, look, one has to use common sense. What about people who have COVID? Obviously, the fact that they have COVID reduces the chance they will fly. Now, that would seem clearly true for those who have severe or critical cases, right? I mean, if they have who would be in the mood for flying with a severe case? Some people do. There have been in 2020, 2 Americans died from COVID while flying. But still, you would assume there's quite a bit of filtering. On the other hand, for those who are asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic, many of them have not gotten tested. They have no idea that they have COVID, so many of them will fly. Not all, by any means. Those who have friends, for example, who came down with COVID and I suspect they have COVID, even if they haven't been tested, or in some cases they have been tested. And then you've got some who are sort of in the intermediate category, namely they have symptoms, sniff, coughing, whatnot, which is somewhat similar to the common cold, but really is a symptom of a mild case of COVID. And some of these people will travel, some of them not, right? Those who say, I have these symptoms, maybe I should get tested, and if the test is positive, they will not fly, I assume. But on the other hand, others will say, oh, this is nothing, and they will not be tested and they will fly. And some others think it may be something, but I really want to travel, so I'm not going to look into this. So in any case, what I'm saying is there is a filtering process based on having COVID, and it also relates to the severity of the case of COVID. Okay? Now let me just talk a little bit about how this is done. First of all, this issue about affluent Americans, to what extent are they less likely to carry COVID than randomly chosen citizens? Well, here I actually looked at two data sources. One of them was my home Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where we had, for each town, we had the COVID-19, the observed rate. We also had some statistics about how affluent it is, the median income, etc. We also had statistics that I got from Airlines for America about the level of affluence of people who fly. And you will not be surprised to know there is a strong correlation between the amount of flying done and the level of let's say, family income. So we put those together to try to estimate the extent to which people from the more affluent communities that fly more actually have lesser risk of carrying COVID. Now, this itself is complicated because we have statistics about how many people fly per capita from, let's say, Silicon Valley, as opposed to, let's say, the Imperial Valley in California. But those are all pre-COVID. And I don't know whether or not during the pandemic the same patterns prevail. We made the assumption that they did, that the more affluent people were still more likely to fly. I can tell you, I live in Belmont, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston, and it is relatively affluent. I can say everyone I knew there basically was afraid to fly. So it could be that if you actually looked at who fly during COVID, it may not reflect the pattern pre-COVID, but we used the pre-COVID pattern. But it turns out it didn't matter that much, ladies and gentlemen, because we used these data, and then we used some data from England and Wales. And in both cases, the ratio we got, sort of the multiplier associated with the affluence, was about 0.8, meaning that the risk for those from the more affluent communities was about 4/5 as high as the risk of Americans in general. At least that's our estimate. I would have thought the estimate would be 0.3 or 0.4. But when we actually looked at the numbers, yes, there is a relationship between affluence and the chance of coming down with COVID, and there is a relationship with the chance of flying as a function of income, but when you actually process the numbers, it didn't matter all that much. In any case, though, we did process those numbers. What else did we do? Oh, well, as I've actually sort of talked to you about it, the other filter was associated with the fact that people with COVID were less likely to fly. And as I said, there are really four categories: the asymptomatic COVID cases, pre-symptomatic, mild symptoms, and severe critical symptoms. And we estimated the probability of flying as a function of this. You might say, how did you make those estimates? Well, out of the air. No, basically, we made estimates reflecting the fact that we expected the further you further down you went here, the higher the probability. We made point estimates, but we assigned probability distributions, and given the imprecision of our estimates, these distributions had to have relatively high standard deviations, okay? In other words, there were no data. If there were any data about this, we of course would have used it. But there were no such data. So we did the best we could. We used distributions, and we proceeded that way. Anyway, that concerns the issue of what's the probability that someone boarding a plane actually carries contagious COVID-19 during that 9-month period, June 2020 to February 2021. That was getting on the plane, but what about the transmission? So let's talk a little bit about that, and I'll tell you about our strategy. I'm going to consider the special case now where there's exactly one contagious person on board. It will not surprise you that the analysis is simpler that way. It turns out that the risk is essentially linear in the number on board. If you have 3 on board, your chance is about 3 times as high that someone sitting next to you has a contagious case of COVID. Anyway, what we did was, we first of all noted that what is the chance that the contagious passenger transmits to an uninfected passenger? It depends on 3 things. One of them is the proximity. The airline planes do have very good filter systems, the HEPA air filters, And if I'm sitting next to someone who's contagious who sneezes, then I'm close by. But if I'm 6 rows behind, the air filtration system, the chances are will catch the germ before they get to me. So we did assume, actually, that basically close proximity was important. And the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, has taken the same view. So proximity is an issue. Another issue is the duration of the flight. Obviously, the longer the flight, the greater the chance that the person who is infected will wind up causing an infection from you. And then the third element is, during this period, everyone wore masks. So we have to take into account the benefits associated with masking. That's, by the way, not so easy. We actually were pretty generous in terms of assuming masks were effective. But you know, and I know, people pull down the mask, have a Diet Coke, and then keep it down for an hour. So the effective rate of masking might have been lower than the theoretical rate. But we were saying masks tend to reduce the risk. Proximity tends to increase the risk. Duration tends to increase the risk. We actually had a formula. I'm going to show you. One last thing I'll say, though, is you might say, Barnett, what about when you're getting on the plane? What about someone passing you en route to the laboratory? Aren't those sources of risk? Yes, they are, but remember at this time, and now we're talking about the original variant of COVID, not the kinds of variants of, let's say, the Omicron BA2 that we have now. The CDC said at that time, if you are in contact with someone with COVID, if it's less than 15 minutes, you don't even have to get tested. Meaning they thought that COVID was not so contagious. So a very short interaction could not really generate a case of COVID. So I thought, well, even getting on the plane, you know, it's a mob scene, but it's way below 15 minutes. So I said, we're focusing on the risk associated with where you are seated. If there are other risks, getting on, off, the lavatory, they would only be added to the risk we're describing. But our first assessment is, given the 15-minute rule, those other risks are second-order effects. Now, the last thing, we're almost there, but 2 papers were highly influential in our modeling. The first one appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It was a simulation of viral transmissions on U.S. jet aircraft, and it came up with the rule. The model, they said, is that they assume if you have a contagious passenger, this was general virus, not COVID, okay? The paper appeared in 2018. They said that your risk of getting it depends on where you are relative to the contagious passenger, and they had a 1 meter rule. If you're within a radius of 1 meter, then you were at risk of coming down with an infection. And they assumed a rather simple model. Every minute, you have a certain risk of infection if you're within 1 meter of the infected person. And every minute that you don't get infected, you go back in the lottery, you might get infected in the next minute, okay? So they, in particular, they assumed your chance per minute of getting infected, if you're next to someone with a virus, was 1.8%. So that meant there's a 1.8% chance you would get it, and 98.2% chance you wouldn't. But if you don't get it, you have a chance of 1.8% in the next minute. In other words, sort of a geometric probability distribution was the one that they assumed. And it seemed like a reasonable model. It obviously has a pedigree in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So we did use some elements of this modeling. But there was another paper that was very influential that appeared in The Lancet, another respected journal, and this was one about the transmission of viruses versus distance, and it was based on a meta-analysis of 216 studies, okay? And in particular, they said, you know, there's a simple rule for proximity and the risk of infection. And they said the further away you are from the infected person, your risk goes down. It goes down by roughly a factor of 2 for each additional meter, okay? So in other words, after 2 meters, you were a factor of 4 below. It was, in other words, a simple mathematical rule. We used this paper and the rule partly because the rule in the PANS paper was artificial, that if you're 0.999 meters away, you're at risk, and 0.10001, you're not at risk at all. So this discontinuous model they used in the first paper struck us as unrealistic. For the relationship with distance, we did assume exponential decay as you got further away. And in particular, here's the equation we came up with, and it won't intimidate you people, but here's the risk per minute. Remember, we're going with the PANS paper. Your risk per minute, first of all, what is your distance from the person who is infected? We call that D, and you'll see we have an e to the minus omega d, exponential decay of risk with distance from the Lancet paper. Pi 0 is the baseline level of risk if you're literally sitting on the lap of the infected person and maybe kissing, etc. We won't go into detail. But in any case, in other words, that's sort of the baseline. And from that level, you have exponential decay. Another thing that came up, though, is what about seatbacks? You know, I've read papers, and common sense indicates seatbacks actually might protect the people who are ahead of you. If I'm infected with COVID and I sneeze, the germs will hit the seatback ahead of me and bounce back. So in other words, to some extent, they reduce the risk for the person in the row ahead of me. And the same thing happens for the person in the row behind me, because they bounce back, and then they hit my seatback, and then they bounce to and fro. But there is some benefit. But how much? Nothing in the literature. I saw two papers, including the PNAS paper, that said that seatbacks mattered, but they didn't know how much. What we did is we said, let's say lambda is the probability that a particular seatback will protect you from the person in the row behind. I'm sorry, can I speak it? Why don't we finish this up, and then if you start the question, I'll answer it. Right? And maybe you'll forget it's whole. Okay? I'm sorry. But in any case, though, there is, as far as I know, there is no literature. So we said, let's say lambda is the benefit per seatback, the probability it will protect you if you're one row away. And if you're several rows away, let's say 3 seatbacks, we assume lambda, lambda, lambda. So the probability of failure will be something like 1 minus lambda cubed, okay? In other words, once again, we're sort of assuming sort of a geometric decay. The more seatbacks between you and that passenger, the more you benefit from the seatback effect. So you benefit from the proximity rule, the exponential decay, but even beyond that, we said, the seatbacks, actually may offer some protection. Again, we don't know what lambda is. We assigned it a probability distribution, sort of the best we could, saying we were kind of ignorant. And the last stage of the following that I'll tell you about is that's the risk per minute, right? If the flight is T minutes long, then the way you avoid infection throughout the flight is to have every minute you avoid it. And the probability of avoiding it of all of them will be 1 minus b to the t, right? If that's the probability of avoiding it, 1 minus it, that is the probability that sooner or later you will come down with the infection. You see? In other words, it's a relatively simple model as these models go. And we didn't think we should do anything more because so much was uncertain even in this model. Anyway, now, if you have a quick question, I'd be glad to answer it now.
Yeah, I have a question regarding how you calculate the distance. So you say that D is a grid distance?
Yes, very quickly. We use grid distance, meaning basically, a grid distance, you go north, south, east, west. The reasoning there was if I'm in 16A and I sneeze, if my emissions go above the seatback ahead of me, they would initially affect the person in, let's say, 15A. And then they might bounce over to the person in 15B. So in other words, they might take a path, not the diagonal path, but basically along the legs of the right triangle. You will not fail to notice this is all kind of speculative. But you noticed a good point. I was trying to avoid it, but you were too shrewd. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the results. But the first thing I want to talk to you about is how do we estimate, let's say, pi 0? What is the baseline level of risk? Here we went to the literature. We looked at every paper we could find, there were I believe 10 of them, that first of all told you that there was a case, or more than one case, of COVID-19 on board, and we were able to look at where people were seated relative to that person, and how many of those people got COVID. Okay? In other words, they basically showed you a seat map of the plane with the COVID people, the non-COVID people, so we can get a sense of the risk distribution on these flights. None of them are U.S. flights because we don't really have any contact tracing. We have no idea how many people get on the plane carrying COVID. When you think about it, we can't do that anywhere in the U.S. How many people have gotten COVID in a bowling alley or the light rail or restaurants? We just don't know. But other countries have actually been more careful about it, so we got some data. And let me just show you some of the data about the level of risk. One of them was a flight from Vietnam Airlines from London to Hanoi. One person in business class had COVID, and she infected 11 of the 12 passengers within 2 rows of her. Okay? The passengers who were further away got infected at much, much lower rates. I think only one of the remaining passengers. And you know, some of the skeptics in the airlines who wanted to discredit the study said, well, maybe they got it in the lounge before they got on the plane. I guess that's conceivable, but wouldn't it be an amazing coincidence if the way people were seated in the lounge exactly corresponded to where they're seated on the plane? But anyway, there was a 92% infection rate, no masks were worn. You see a number of other flights here. I particularly want to call your attention to a Japanese domestic flight, a 737-800 from Osaka to Okinawa. There was one passenger on board who had COVID-19, and they did all kinds of testing of the other passengers, including the structure of the COVID germs they had, and they concluded that of the 23 people seated within 2 rows of that person, at least 7 of them got COVID on the plane. They had a few others, they said, probably. We basically took the 7. It could have been as high as 10, but we thought, let's be conservative, etc. The same way there was a flight from Dublin, what is the flight here? Dubai to Dublin, okay? They say at least 4 passengers came down with COVID in flight. We counted it as exactly 4, okay? That's why we have this footnote, etc. over here. So we were not overstating it, but you will see that first of all, in most of these flights, there was transmission, okay, despite the heap of filters, which the airlines are so proud. And we also had some of them had masks, some of them didn't, some of them did. We had some baseline information for estimating our parameters. We are effectively assuming that these are representative of flights. People might say, Barnett, those are outliers, so you're just taking extreme cases and trying to use them to advance a position. That's not true. We took every study we found. If there is a bias in terms of which things get published, that might be. We simply can't deal with it. But this is what we found. Here are numbers, ladies and gentlemen, because I know you've been patient and finish up. And here are numbers taking into account, among other things, where people were seated on the plane. What was the percentage of seats occupied? And we got information on this during the pandemic from industry sources, but curiously, we are taking this down? I'm sorry, this is being...
Yeah, it's recorded.
Oh, so I have to watch what I say. Anyway, we benefited from industry sources which did not want to be identified with this work. Okay? I didn't say that. I deny it. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, when we did the calculations the best we could, these are the point estimates we came up with. We had a probability distribution because we had probability distributions for the individual parameters. We used simulation to combine these assumptions. And here are the kinds of numbers we come up with, the mean and the median of the distribution. Some prefer the mean as a point estimate, some prefer the median. You can take either one of them. The median tended to be a little bit below the mean, but you'll notice the numbers for this 8-month period with there were 204 million passengers who flew on U.S. domestic flights over that period. Our point estimate of the mean, it was 1 out of every 1,700 would have come down with COVID in flight, taking into account the likelihood of having people who had COVID on board, the percentage of seats occupied, and the likelihood of being close to someone who had COVID. We tried to take all of that into account, okay? For the median, it was a little lower, 1 in 2,100, okay? So these are estimates. Are these estimates too high? I can only tell you, to the extent that we could, we tended to lowball things. For example, as they say, when they say at least 4 people came down with COVID, we counted it as 4. Okay? We assumed that masks were about 70% effective. And that's a pretty good number if you assume, firstly, that people were wearing the masks nearly all the flight, and secondly, that the masks were relatively good. You know, some of these masks, these bandanas or whatnot, may have been sort of pseudo-masks. But we used a high estimate, in other words, of the effectiveness of masking. So if we are off, I'm not ready to say that we overstated the risk. If I had to make a guess, if anything, we understated it. Let me just end with a question. And that is, let's assume 1 in 2,000 is sort of our estimate for the period. I leave it up to you whether that risk is quote-unquote virtually non-existent. And don't forget, that's for a 2-hour segment. If you fly, let's say twice a month, round trips, that 2-hour flights each way, that's roughly 4 times that, right? So now you're up to about 1 in 500 per month, let's say. So I don't think 1 in 2,000 really is an estimate that would be virtually non-existent. On the other hand, as I indicated, the confidence interval is pretty big for this estimate, meaning the margin of error is great because not knowing what happened, we used diffuse probability distributions for quantities we didn't know, such as the effectiveness of CPAP. Well, if you have all this uncertainty in the input parameters, when you run the simulation, you're going to get variability among the results. So I warn you that the answer could be somewhat higher, and it could be somewhat lower than that. But this is our best point estimate of what actually was going on here. And now let me ask one last question before I open up to any questions you have. What about deaths? After all is said and done, that's what we fear the most from COVID. It's true, long COVID is very bad, and having a case of COVID can be very miserable. But the U.S. Supreme Court once said death is different. So if death is different, what can we say about deaths caused by COVID infections on board? That's a very difficult question, partly because those who died because of COVID that was caught on board were not necessarily on the plane. On my stereotypical cases, you have an 18-year-old kid on the plane, comes down with COVID, and he himself is at very low mortality risk. But he goes to visit his grandparents, and they themselves are at much higher risk if they get COVID. And they themselves are part of a social group. They get together for the church social. In other words, the propagation of risk means that, as best as I can tell, those, and we'll never know who they are, who died of COVID because of cases contracted on planes, I think the overwhelming majority were not on the planes. They were these indirect effects. It's the nature of an epidemic that things get passed on. What I can say is the following. We can do some rough calculations. Remember, there were 204 million passengers in the 8-month period. If you believe the chance of coming down with COVID is something like 1 in 2,000, if you do the arithmetic, what do we assume? We know how many cases there would be because we divide 204 million by 2,000? And I'm saying, what if you assume that for every 500 cases of COVID on board, 1 death results? Again, not necessarily by any means to a person on board, but possibly to a person who got it from a person on board. Well, if you do the arithmetic, that would constitute about 200 total deaths that were caused by COVID-19 infections which contracted on U.S. domestic flights. If instead you believed that, let's say, 1 death per 300 onboard infections, then the arithmetic changes a little bit, and the total number corresponding death toll would be about 300. If, on the other hand, you said that basically for every 100 cases there was 1 additional death, then the actual arithmetic would imply 1,000 deaths overall. I can't tell you which of these numbers prevails. If I had to make a guess, I don't think it's as high as 1,000, but I can easily imagine that the number might be in the hundreds. There's no, luckily for me and for my co-author, there's no way of falsifying that because we don't know. We know, of course, that there were virtually 1 million deaths from COVID in the United States. How many of them were cases of COVID that ultimately traced to U.S. domestic flights, no one knows. I'm just saying that playing around with the numbers, trying with a model to get a feeling for the size of the effect, led us to conclusions that it might be a number that's not that small. You see, U.S. aviation, prior to COVID, got to the point where a typical year we'd have 0 deaths. So against that backdrop, if we had 100 or 200, that would be a relatively bad year, as if we had 1 very bad crash, let's say. On the other hand, against the backdrop of hundreds of thousands and up to nearly 1 million deaths, it's really a secondary part of a national calamity. So I'm not going to tell you what to make of the number of deaths, even if we knew what that number is. I do believe, though, that there is some level of risk associated with flying. I believe U.S. Airlines in general have done what they could to discount the level of risk, to ridicule studies that indicated there was risk, and did other things to make people optimistic about flying that I think were excessive, such as the quotations I gave you from United and Southwest. But anyway, I haven't stopped flying. I'm flying home tonight. I assure you I will wear my N95 mask. And being from the Northeast, I don't like to talk to people anyway. So I'll try to stay away from all other passengers on board. But I'm not suggesting we not fly. But on the other hand, we should not fly under the illusion that the risk is virtually non-existent. So that's my presentation, and I'm very happy to answer your questions about it. Yes, Raj.
Is that 1 in 2,000 number independent of the disease prevalence in the population?
No, what we did was we estimated the number of cases in each week.
Yeah.
And that was based upon the official numbers and a multiplier to reflect the underestimation that week.
So it does depend on the disease prevalence?
Yes, it did. And it varied, and that's one of the reasons as we went from month to month, we saw these variations.
Yeah. So is there another number which would tell me what if there's exactly 1 person on the plane with COVID? What's the probability I would get it? Is a number kind of like independent of the disease prevalence in the population?
The answer is we had to do that because, don't forget, we basically, part of our estimate was if there's 1 person, what is the risk? And then we said, what's the probability there's 1 person? So we did do that. And I would say typically, it would actually be, I think, a little bit higher than 1 in 2,000. Well, let me think about this. About the number. If you know there's someone on the plane,
Yeah.
I think the answer is it will be higher than that because you see, there are 174 people on our hypothetical plane, even if it's full. And the estimate, a typical estimate of the probability that a person getting on board would carry COVID was something like 1 in 400. So in other words, on most flights, we estimated there was 0 on board. And if you had 1 or more on board, then you would even be more than the 1 in 2,000.
Yeah.
But I'll be glad to send you the paper, but you can deduce, and I think we have tables that indicate that it is higher than that if there's someone with COVID on board. But there's only about a 30% chance, roughly, that there was someone with COVID on board. You see now, 1 second, sir. Now, ladies and gentlemen, how does this translate into the situation today? Many of us are vaccinated. There was no vaccine at the time, and that would seem to reduce the risk. On the other hand, you know, now I was just reading in the New York Times this week, Omicron BA2 itself has spawned 2 new variants, which are more contagious than BA2. So we have the variants of BA2 are more contagious than BA2, which is more contagious than BA1, which is more contagious than Delta. And when you finally, in other words, look at the contagiousness now compared to that in the early period, that itself has changed dramatically for the worse. So it goes in two directions. Vaccination helps us, of course, but the transmission risk is somewhat higher. So how does it all play out? I don't know. I'm sorry, so you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just have a couple quibbles. Maybe they're unimportant, but I'll give you them. The first is, it seems to me that if people get on a plane and they're in the same household, they're likely to sit together. So husband and wife on the same plane, they both have COVID. And the second issue that I have is that even though affluent people fly more, I think there's a subset of affluent people who are frequent flyers, and those people are business travelers probably, and they're also at extreme risk because they go into offices and work in offices, stuff like this. Maybe they sit in a cubicle.
No, what you raise very interesting, very sound points. And as far as business travel, let me take them in reverse order. During this period, don't forget, business travel very dramatically dropped. That most of the passengers flying in the early months of COVID, either were they might have been emergency workers and were not necessarily affluent, or they were, in many cases, people traveling because a relative is ill. So in other words, the bias toward business travelers, I think, will be less in the period. Don't forget, but as you say though, business travelers fly a lot. So their cumulative risk, if we believe any of these numbers, would have been a lot higher. But we basically assumed, and I admit it's an imperfect assumption, that each person coming on board had a certain probability and different people were independent. You're absolutely right. A husband and wife are not independent. If they are on good terms with one another, they might be sitting next to one another, otherwise not. We did some calculations that suggested that it doesn't matter so much. If I have two people, we had in fact one flight where there was a couple, both of them were infected, okay? It was a flight where everyone wore masks. And by the way, no one got infected on that flight. He was one of the ones we considered. But the failure of independence, I believe, in this approximate analysis doesn't change things all that much for a randomly chosen passenger. Because if you have the couple A and B sitting together, my chance of being in C, as opposed to elsewhere in the plane, that's based on the randomness. So I think your points are well taken, but we were approximating around that. Okay, you have other questions? No. Okay. What other? Yes?
I think I have another question regarding the model, like you did the model. So you only consider about like who is originally like infected by the virus. So how about like some newly infected on the plane, and then he can also got the ability to infect the others?
Well, actually, if you mean you become infected on the plane, and therefore I think, look, I'm not a biologist, but my understanding is there is a latency period, an incubation period. So if you got infected on the plane, the chances are you are not contagious. In fact, I know that if you come down with COVID, some of these tests, you have to wait a few days before you will have enough germs that it would register on the test. So I understand your point, and theoretically it could happen. My understanding is it happens very rarely, if at all.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, but no, I mean, these are all points. Again, I assure you people, I understand that this is far from a perfect model, but it is a model. I mean, we should at least try to come up with estimates. People can criticize them, but at least have something on the table as an estimate and then go from there. I will tell you that the U.S. Airlines are very hostile to analysis like this. Okay? And in fact, I may have to go home by bus. Yes, Raj.
So I'm actually going to take what you said. I think it's useful to do stuff like this. It's hard to do stuff like this, but it's useful to do stuff like this. So I'm looking for a context in which to situate that 1 in 1,700 number, right? So if I'm, the chances of me getting COVID in a room like this, to me is 1 in 50, then I would say, I don't know why we're making such a big fuss over the airlines. But if the chances of me getting a COVID in a room like this is 1 in 10,000, and that's 1 in 2,000,
Yeah.
I'd say, well, I mean, Arnold,
No, I get your point.
can we get these guys to do something? You know, that sort of thing.
Well,
I think for
first of all, I
context.
think your point is well taken. However, what we did was to say, this is the risk. And the question is, what do you make of a risk of 1 in 2,000? You're exactly looking at these issues. I'll tell you though, one thing I tried to do was to say, what is the risk of 1 hour in the air versus 1 hour on the ground?
Okay.
And it turned out the risk in the air was a little bit higher than on the ground. If you actually assumed, I looked at the risk on the ground, I assumed that it was divided over 16 hours, the other 8 were sleeping, etc. And the rough estimates I got were that statistically the hour in the air is higher. In other words, I was thinking of the issue of context that you mentioned, but I didn't try to include that in the paper because, you know, it gets too speculative for a paper.
Yeah, I see.
But I think your point is well taken. And you could say, look, we've had this calamity has cost us 1 million lives. So if someone says, well, maybe of the 200 million passengers, maybe 100 deaths come up, people might say, well, what's the big deal? When you fly, if you had one crash, you would have had 100 deaths, and people would not stop flying. So I agree, there's a lot of issue of context. We thought, though, that we should not, in the paper itself, go too far. You know, we were speculating enough for the estimate of the risk of COVID, and trying to relate it to other risks, although valuable, as you say. We just thought that was not for the paper.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes?
I have a question, and this may be more to do with the prevalence of COVID in the population, but it would be my assumption, you can correct me if you know, I just have seen the data on it. It would be my assumption that the age of those who travel skews younger, right, than the general.
Yes, that's right.
So they might be more likely to be like asymptomatic, and they're just generally healthier. Do you think the model appropriately accounts for that relative health in flight?
Well, it doesn't try to. It says, what is the chance of transmitting COVID, etc. And we know that it is true that the consequences of getting COVID depend very much on your age. I mean, I myself have always been in the age range where when you look at the graph, you start to scream, etc., and you are not. And that's why when I say, for example, if you try to go from, let's say, getting COVID on the plane to deaths, you have to take into account the fact that people on the plane are younger and at much lower risk. The question is, though, can they transmit it to people who are at higher risk later on? But in answer to your question, we didn't try, except in that very last slide, the hypothetical slide, to try to go from the risk of getting COVID to the consequences of that. And they very much, as you say, depend on age. In fact, I think I saw a statistic, if you're below 50 years old, then I think your chance of dying of COVID was estimated as 1 in 2,200. The overall risk was about 1 in 200, 0.5%. But so I totally agree with you that many of the people who got on board may never even known it, but they may have transmitted it.
So I think our time is up. Professor Barnett, we have this gift for you. It is a thing that you can drink from, and to make sure that it's reliable, I had each of my students take a drink from it before, and it's completely sound. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I hope all your flights are safe.